It'd be a great time of the year for us to be thinking about this for the grace, but then Thanksgiving, be thankful because we're in the middle of a time which our nation, which we're trying to divide, continue to divide rather than be thankful for what we have. As you know, I love reading and studying about great men and women in our history, our country, or as believers. This last week, I don't usually turn on the news, but I happen to have the news on. They're interviewing a man who's in his 70s, and he was talking about a battle that he was involved in, a military battle for our country, in which he and his comrades were greatly outnumbered. 18 of them, talking about in his group, and they had a strategic place they're trying to keep, and they unexpectedly met an opposition that were far superior at night. They used up all their weapons, all their ammunition, had no ammunition left. And the enemy obviously were throwing grenades and were shooting at them. And his commander said, pick up the rocks and throw them at them. So in the middle of this battle, all they have, and yell. So they're yelling and talking, and the enemy is not sure how many there are because of all the different talking and voices and stuff. And they see the rocks coming at night, and they think they're grenades. And so they hold their position. And every one of them was either wounded or killed, and he, except for him, he had simply a graze on his arm, but they held the position. When you think about it, what would most of us have done?
Cut and run.
Well, kind of hard to cut and run when you're, in a deal like that. And you think about it, most of us would have surrendered. It reminds me of the great military battle, the naval battle. If you remember during the battle for our independence, if you remember when the ship is sinking and the British asked the Commander Jones, do you want to surrender when his ship is sinking? And what was his reply? We've only just begun to fight. And they ended up winning with the sinking ship. You think about it, but these are simply ordinary men and women that we have. What made them extraordinary? What's the difference between ordinary and extraordinary? It's interesting. And what made me think about this, I was bought. I was at a bookstore and kind of caught my eye, extraordinary. And what also caught my eye was $1. I thought, well, hey, I can afford $1 on this book. And it turns out it is mostly to deal with kind of a self-help deal when you need to, basically look at it. But it did get me to thinking about it. In Scripture, we have a lot of extraordinary people, but they were simply ordinary people who did some extraordinary things. And so I'd like for us to look at it. Just a message on extraordinary, and we won't finish it all today, and we won't cover all the people in the Bible, because obviously we'd have all eternity with which to get there. But one thing about it, first of all, the definition. How do you define extraordinary? It comes from Greek words, basically, Latin words, which we just translated literally into English. Extra and ordinary. So extraordinary, which basically simply means that what it is of the outside of the normal course of events. Outside the normal course of events. Not doing what's normal. So what happens, if we want to be extraordinary, we're going to have to, and it's going to be in every one of our lives at different times, when we are being placed in a position, are we going to do what normal people would do? Or are we going to do what God wants us to do, and maybe not be the normal thing to do? So let's look at some of the men and women we have in the Bible. We'll just look at a few of them. We know their stories well, so I'll just give you part of it. The first one I was thinking of is Joseph. And I'll just give you the background. I'm mainly interested in just one aspect of his life. But if you remember, he's sold into slavery in Genesis 37. And it's interesting in Genesis 37, it says his brothers hated him. A little later on in the passage, it says they hated him even more. Later in the passage, it says they hated me even more. And the third time in the same passage, it says they hated me even more. You talking about being hated. And obviously, he gets the coat, and then he then also talks about they're going to bow down to him. And so obviously not in a very good situation. Hating him greatly. And then if you remember, he's sold into slavery. So in 39, you notice he happens to be in Potiphar's house, and he does everything right. And the Lord's really blessing him. And obviously with Potiphar's wife then making passes at him, and then he flees and she makes the lie about him. So now he's in jail. What would most of us be doing by now? You think about it, he's doing everything right. What would the normal person be doing? Well, then he's in jail, and if he's in jail, you notice he does everything right in jail too. Well, the jailer recognizes it, and he rises even within the jail. God's blessing him, and he gives credit to that. And then you interpret two dreams for the cupbearer and the butler and the baker, and notice then you have nothing happens. 2 years later, nothing happens. And then you come down with Pharaoh's dream. Now you think about it, with Pharaoh's dream, what would you do? Would you I'll tell you your dream, Pharaoh, but there's some conditions. Did Joseph give him any conditions?
No.
So after you tell the dream to Pharaoh, where would you normally probably go back? What would most of us do? All right, yeah, God's given me this ability. I'll tell you, but I want out of here. I want my independence. You know, think about it. What would ordinary people do? What would you and I do? God's given him the ability. He gives it with no strings attached. He even makes suggestions, obviously to Pharaoh, of what to do during the 7 years of feast, and then obviously preparing for the 7 years of famine. And obviously he had no idea that Pharaoh was going to put a prisoner in charge of it, and that high up. That was never part of it. But it takes us then, when you think about it, Genesis 50, then I'm thinking about with Joseph, and the point I want to make. So obviously they do well, all the family comes down, and they've done well, and they're living in Goshen, doing things well. And you notice in Genesis chapter 50, when Joseph's in verse 15, Genesis 50:15, when Joseph's brothers saw their father was dead, what if Joseph should bear a grudge against us and pay us back in full for all the wrong which we did to him? Is that ordinary person? So in other words, they're saying, well, the only reason he hadn't done anything is because he loves Dad and he didn't want to create a conflict. Dad's gone, he's going to pay us back. Is that what an ordinary person would do? So they make a lie, you know. They go cohort and make a lie and go to Joseph and tell him about it. They fall down before him, which is interesting. Remember, they got mad they weren't going to do that. And they're doing it rather willingly and knowing who he is. But notice in verse 19, Joseph says to them, "Do not be afraid, for am I in God's place." Amazing, amazing statement. But then verse 20, "As for you, you meant it evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring about this present result, preserve many people alive. So therefore, do not be afraid. I'll provide for you and your little ones." Notice it. I'm not even going to forgive you. I'm going to keep providing my position. I'm going to provide for you. You don't deserve it, but I'm going to even forgive you, and I'm going to provide. And that's what I think, talking about an extraordinary person, is the fact that Joseph forgave. How many times are you and I going to be in positions where we need to forgive? You know, I think it's amazing. If you haven't, you will. There will not be a single person, family, friend, work, wherever it is, will be willing. And that's the difference between an ordinary person and an extraordinary person. Did Christ forgive us? And we're told to forgive as Christ did what? Forgave us. So let's think about it. Do you think about the first one, just with Joseph, extraordinary person, that is forgiveness. If I was in Joseph's position, what would I do? Would I forgive or seek revenge? Second thing about Joseph, would I be bitter? How many of us would be bitter? You do everything right and everything seems to be going wrong. Now God's preparing it, and He's using all this, but Joseph is not given a roadmap. Joseph is not told, hey, hang on, I'm preparing you, this is going to happen. He's not given any of it. So I think it's best then. So the first one is Joseph and then a forgiveness. The second one I'm thinking about is that with Moses. I kind of thought I'd just start with Genesis and start going through a little bit. You think about with Moses, obviously, when in the children of Israel, in Exodus 7 to 12, you remember you have the 10 plagues. You have the 10 plagues, which obviously you're going before Pharaoh, and you don't exactly have a lot of friends among the Israelites when you're Moses, when you're doing this, because things are getting very tough for them. They do get their freedom, and then in chapter 13, they're talking about the children of Israel now, they're being led by what? A cloud and the fire, correct? They're being led. In 14, you remember you have the great deal in which God parts the Red Sea, and they go on dry land, and the Egyptians are destroyed. All leading up to it. Then you get to chapter 15 to 17, 3 different times, what happens to the children of Israel? Water's bitter. And God's led them there, and they're mad, and they take it out on Moses. And then they don't have food, and God provides manna. And then they don't have drinking water, and God provides water. Very dissatisfied people. And you think about these greatly dissatisfied people, and he then goes up on the mountain, if you remember, in Exodus 31, 32, and Aaron makes the golden calf. And the disaster with the golden calf, and so you turn down to, you think about Exodus 32, when Moses is coming down, God is going to do what? God says, I'm going to destroy this people, and I'm going to make a nation out of you and your people. And what would you do? Praise God, I'm getting rid of this 2 million people. I want you to think about it. You're doing everything God tells you to do, and these people are nothing but a pain. And you have it's mentioned in Exodus 32, it's mentioned in Deuteronomy 9, it's mentioned in Numbers 14. Obviously something pretty important that Moses does. Let's just look at Deuteronomy 9. It's in all 3 passages, but look over in Deuteronomy 9. It's in Exodus 32, but it's a little longer there. Deuteronomy 9, notice in verse 18, God's going to get rid of them, and he throws the tablets down. I'm talking about what Moses does. He throws them down in 17. Notice in verse 18, Deuteronomy 9:18. And I fell down before the Lord as at the first, 40 days and 40 nights, and neither ate bread or drank water, because of all your sin, which you committed in doing what was evil in God's sight, to provoke him to anger. For I was afraid of the anger and hot displeasure with which God was wrathful against you, in order to destroy you. But the Lord listened to me at that time. He intercedes. Lord, don't do it. You let them out of Egypt, and the Egyptians, other nations, are looking, and you're supposed to be a chosen people. Don't destroy them. So he obviously is going to punish them. So he's saying no to making me a great nation. And he's interceding. How many of us would intercede, or how many of us just say, fine, get rid of it? That's one less pain. It's amazing, the intercession. Notice verse 20, the reason I chose this passage. The Lord was angry enough with Aaron to destroy him. So I also prayed for Aaron at the same time. Did Aaron cause him any problems? Mm-hmm. It's interesting, God not only forgave Aaron, but the priesthood comes from whom? Aaron. You think about it. So here you have Joseph, and it's amazing just his forgiveness. And with Moses, I'm thinking, what about others over self? Was he thinking about the Israelites and the nation, or was he thinking about himself? If you're thinking about yourself, what would you do? Let's do it, Lord. Do it tomorrow. Do it today. And let's get on with it. And I think about this, you think about it when you look at this intercession of Moses, others over self. That's what we're told in Philippians 2, right? Only think your own interests, but also the interests of others. And he talks then about Christ in verse 5. So think about this when it talks about with Moses. Would I think of myself and maybe my family and allow God to make a great nation for my offspring? Or would I intercede for a people who don't deserve it? It drive me nuts. That's to being honest here. How many of us are willing to intercede for the very people who are driving you nuts? Lord, spare them. And the Lord does. Now He punishes them, and obviously they're not later allowed to go into the promised land, but the children do, and so on. Moses intercedes for. It's interesting how many times he intercedes. And I think we can do the same. So here you have Joseph, extraordinary because of his forgiveness. You have Moses, extraordinary because he thinks of others over himself. I think a lot of us will think, okay, I'll go so far, but then they've gone too far. You think of the children of Israel, they went too far how many times? And Moses led them the entire time. Since we're talking about the children of Israel, the next one I was thinking about is just that of Joshua and Caleb. We know the story well of Joshua and Caleb in Numbers 13 and in Numbers 14. Let's look over it. And we know that they send out the representatives. By the way, who selected the representatives?
People.
The people did. The first time. God does the second time. So normally when we select the leaders, the normal people, we select the natural leader and not necessarily a spiritual leader. Very, very big difference. We need the same thing on a church or anything else. We need to select spiritual leaders, not natural leaders. They may be the same. And so and by the way, all of them are named. How many of you can name all 12 of them? Why do we only remember 2? Because they did extraordinary. They didn't do the ordinary. If you want to be remembered, you have to do what's out of the ordinary and not what is ordinary. And I think many of you are doing that, actually. I think many of you are extraordinary in what God's allowing you to do or called you to do. Let's think about this. You have it in Numbers 13. They come back and they give the report saying, truly it is a land flowing of milk and honey in 27, but we can't go there. They're giants, and we're just going to be grasshoppers, and they're going to destroy us. God just said that He's given them the land. So in verse 30, notice Caleb quiets the people. We should by all means go up and take possession, for we shall surely overtake him. But, notice what they do. They go against him and don't support it. But Caleb, was he willing to stand up and speak? How many of us are willing to speak up for what's right when the majority are speaking for what's wrong? Most of the time we just keep quiet. But he's one of the 12 that go. So you go to the next chapter, and you notice in 14, in verse 4, the people want to anoint a new leader and go back to Egypt. Have they forgotten what all's taken place? It's amazing how we hear it all the time. Before we get too upset, how many of us are always talking about the good old days? We remember the good old days. How many of you want to go back to points and condenser? Well, every time you turn around, they're breaking down on the side of the road. They're working one day and then they're not. You have a lot of things that, anyway, they wanted to go back. But notice what happens then in verse 6. Moses and Aaron fall on their face in verse 5 and intercede. But notice Joshua and Caleb in verse 6, they tear their clothes. And notice together in verse 7, they spoke to all the congregation of the sons of Israel, the land which possesses through espy is out an exceedingly good land. If the Lord is pleased with us, then He will bring us into this land and give it to us, a land which flows with milk and honey. Do not rebel against the Lord. Do not fear the people, for they shall be our prey. Their protection has been removed from them, and the Lord is with us. Do not fear them. I want you to think about it. Their protection has been removed. Who has the weapons?
They do.
Who has the walled cities?
They do.
Then how can their protection be taken away from them?
God.
So does Caleb, let's think about it. Caleb and Joshua, I like to call it faith walking. They see that walled city as no walled city. They see those weapons as non-weapons. Because God said, I'm going to give it to you. But how many of us are looking at the obstacles? That's what makes Joshua and Caleb extraordinary. Hey, now I want you to think about it too. God says they get to go in. The others are going to all die. How many of you want to wait 38 years for it to take place? You don't get to go for 38 years because of what other people did. And you wait. It's amazing when you look at it. So here you have, Joseph with his forgiveness, Moses with others over self. Then you have Joshua and Caleb. and they're faith walking. Hey, we can take this. I don't care how big they are. What's amazing now, when you think about it, when Caleb goes in, how old is he now?
85.
Okay, he's 80, and it takes 5 years for them to go through the different parts of the land. And they divide the land up. He's now 85, and what does he ask for? I want the mountain where the biggest giant is living and his sons. Because with God's help, I'm going to take it, because that's what he said. You notice, hey, he made it a practice. Not only 40 years earlier, I am still faith walking all the way to the end. And he does. He defeats him. And he takes it. It's amazing. So am I willing to go to battle against superior foes with God on my side? Or how many of us just look at the opposition or through our human eyes or our senses, and that's how we make decisions? Can't do it. Well, that's just ordinary people doing it. Ordinary people say we can't do all these things. If God is laying on our heart to do something, or tells us to do something, then we need to be extraordinary and go do it. What about David? I mean, there's so many things you can say about David. We look over in 1 Samuel 24. It's amazing with David. David is anointed king when he was a youth, correct? But who's king? Saul is. But who's really king? Okay, so in 1 Samuel 24, obviously Saul is out there trying to kill him. And he is told in verse 1 where David is. Notice in the other way, David has 400 people, 400 soldiers with him. So Saul in verse 2 takes how many? 3,000 chosen men. He's bringing 3,000 of the best. And they're going after David. Okay, so obviously then in verse 3, he goes to a cave. Saul goes in the cave to relieve himself. And notice then David and the men are inside, which they don't know it. And they're hiding. And notice what does the men say in verse 4. The men of David said to him, Behold, this is the day which the Lord said to you, Behold, I'm about to give your enemy in your hand, and you shall do to him that he seems good to you. Alright? Here's the opposition. Lord's given it to him. Kill him. You're the rightful king anyway. God's already said it. Just take him out. Take matters in your own hand. He cuts off a corner of his robe in verse 4, which David then feels bad about it. His conscience is bothering him. Notice in verse 4, so he said to his men, Far be it from me, because the Lord, that I should do this thing to the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, since he is the Lord's anointed. David persuaded his men with these words, and did not allow them to rise up against Saul. Notice David wouldn't do it, and he had enough power over the 400 men. Now you remember, if you go back in David's, when he got these 400 men, how are they described? They're disgruntled and everything else, and they're military men. And when they look at it from a military standpoint, this is the time to do it. You get rid of Saul, and this whole thing ends. This whole thing ends. Now, when you think about it, what about faith waiting? He's willing to say what? No. He's wanting to be king. When he wants me to be king, God will do what? God will take Saul out of the way. He'll put me in position when he's good and ready. And God uses a lot of this in David's life. But how much any of you ever kind of jump ahead and try to do things on your own and hurry up God's plan? Does that ever happen to any of you? Or is that just me? How many of you ever botched God's plan? He has to go to plan B and then C and then D and then E, and keep going. But think about it. Do I wait for the Lord, or do I often take it in my own hands? Do I realize my taking a stand can affect others? By David taking a stand, did it affect the other 400 men?
Yes.
They didn't do it because of David's stand. Do you realize we can take a stand too? By not saying something that others are saying, by not doing things that others want to do, we can take a stand. So think about it. Here you have Joseph is forgiving. You have Moses who has others over self. You have Joshua and Caleb who are willing to walk by faith. Here you have David who's willing to have the faith waiting. I'll give you another one. Maybe you haven't thought about this one. What about 1 Kings 18? And it's not going to be about Elijah, although he's one we certainly could use. 1 Kings 18. Yeah, this is when obviously the famine is in the land, and Ahab, you remember Elijah pronounces it, and later in this chapter he's going to then go up against tries to go against 850 false prophets. He only goes to half of them, the other half don't show up. But I want you to think about, how many of you ever considered the servant Obadiah? Not the prophet Obadiah, but the servant Obadiah. Look at what it says in verse 2. You have the famine is severe, and then notice in verse 3, and Ahab had called Obadiah, who was over the household. So notice he's a servant over the whole household. Obadiah feared the Lord greatly. I want you to think about that, God-fearing. You're serving the most wicked people that you could possibly serve in Ahab and Jezebel, but you fear the Lord. Notice what he does in verse 4. You'll find it again in 13. For it came about when Jezebel destroyed the prophets of the Lord that Obadiah took 100 prophets, hid them by 50s in a cave, and provided bread and water. Where do you think he got the bread and water from?
From the king.
And what would happen to him if Ahab or Jezebel finds out about it? And how easy is it to get enough food and water to haul off to 2 different locations for 100 people in the middle of a drought and a famine? Who did he fear more? Notice it says he feared God greatly. He feared God more than he feared who? Ahab and Jezebel. Would you call him extraordinary? But notice, he's just simply a servant, but he fears God greatly more. And so I think it's interesting, who do I fear the most? You notice in Galatians 1 in verse 12, it makes the statement, Paul says, if I were wanting to please men, I wouldn't be a bondservant of Jesus Christ. Who do I fear the most? There's many others, and I was going to do another one, but just for the sake of time, I'll stop. Why don't you read something to you? This is in this book, and I thought it was kind of interesting. It's the fable, it's a book, it's a fable story of a life of a journey. Santiago is a shepherd who sets out from Spain to South Africa in search for a promised treasure. And when he gets halfway there, he is befriended, and his friend steals all his money. So he's left penniless and alone, and he can't obviously get any further on his journey. So he talks his way into a job at a dirty shop, a crystal shop, and the owner lost all motivation and agrees to let him work. Santiago cleans the items of the store, sells them, and brings success to the shop and himself. The now happy shop owner, a kind Muslim man, spends his afternoons with Santiago drinking tea and talking about what they're going to do if they made enough money. Santiago dreams of a home, and the shop owner dreams of making a trip to Mecca. Every day they talk about this conversation, what their dream is. Finally, one day comes along and Santiago says, I've got enough money, I'm going to make my journey. And I've made you enough money that you can make your journey to Mecca. It's an interesting statement. The friend tells him, no, you're different from me. You want to realize your dreams. I just want to dream them. How many ordinary people want to be extraordinary, but they don't want to be extraordinary for what it takes? We just want to dream about it, but others want to do it okay. The reason I say that there is going to come a time in every one of our lives when we're going to have to make decisions. It may have already come, and it'll come again. When are you going to do what's normal, or when are you going to do what God wants you to do in something extraordinary? And it can happen whether it's taking care of kids. A lot of you open your homes, whether it be to grandkids, to foster kids. It can be to all kinds of things. Most people won't do it. Most people won't open their wallet. Most people won't do a lot of things. Mission trips, whatever it is. Are we going to be ordinary people? Or are we going to be extraordinary people doing what God has laid in our hearts to do, whatever it might be? I think it's interesting. The one we'll look at next week, a lot of them, we'll look at some ladies as well. But think about next week with Nehemiah. How in the world does Nehemiah build a wall? What's his job? A cupbearer. In a city, how many miles away? God lays on his heart to build a wall in a place that its original home, with no money, no experience, but he does it. Extraordinary. So think about it. You have so many others. Ruth, Esther, and 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 so many others.